Hi, this is a presentation which describes permaculture design for Fruitful Forest Garden. So we'll talk through the process that we used to design the garden along with the brief, what surveys we undertook, what some of our research and ideas were, how we came up with the design and how we implemented the design, and then we'll evaluate how we think the forest garden is going, and then a bit of reflection on the design process itself and look at what our next steps are with the forest garden, and then some acknowledgements to people who've helped. So the design process we used for this design was James Chapman's The Simplest Design Process. We used that for the overall process of how we did the design. The actual detailed design for the forest came by using Martin Crawford's book, Creating a Forest Garden. So the brief for our forest garden is to apply permaculture ethics to our site. So from an earth care point of view, we wanted to improve the biodiversity of the site, which to start with was just a pasture for sheep. We wanted to reduce soil erosion that we could see on the steep slope, and we wanted to improve carbon capture and carbon sequestration to try and tackle climate change as best we can with the land that we have. From a future care and fair share point of view, we want to grow as much food as we can and also fuel for ourselves but also for future generations. And we want to provide a habitat to promote the longevity of a biodiverse wildlife here. From people care point of view, we're looking to create something beautiful that we can enjoy and future generations will enjoy. We want a food growing system that will be low maintenance in the long term. We want to grow nutritious food for ourselves and for other people. And we want to incorporate spaces for playing and socialising. So we're located just outside of Aberdour on the Fife coast of Scotland. And that means we're protected from a lot of very cold weather just by being reasonably close to the sea. And we have a 5-acre site, of which about 1.5 acres we've given over to the forest garden. And the garden's on a northeast facing slope. We looked at our limitations and resources. So myself and my husband both work part-time, which limits how much time we can spend here. And also with working part-time, we only earn part-time, which limits how much money we can spend. We do manage to obtain quite a lot of free resources in the terms of cardboard and wood chip and cuttings and things like that. But it does limit what we can spend, so we know that we can't suddenly create a forest garden overnight. Looking at our climate, our sort of driest season is usually April-May time, with a wet season sort of summer through to autumn. Around about August, September is quite wet. We looked at sun charts to see when we would have the most sun and at what angle the sun would be throughout the year. We used a dumping level, so we had our friends from Living Water teach us how to do a topographical survey, and we surveyed the entire site, and obviously the steepest part of the slope is in the area where the forest garden is. We looked at what's already here and some of the things we might want to do. So we looked at plants, animals, structures, tools and events, created a list of all of those things. And we also tried to understand what our local biome is, partly just through experiencing it, going out on local walks into our nearby woodland, and also looking at the riparian woodland that borders the eastern edge of the site, and also just through reading up from local library books. And we looked at our soil, which is a heavy clay soil, acidic soil. We looked at the soil food web to see what kind of microbiology was down there, with the help of Daniel Tierkel from the Soil Ecology Lab, and discovered not very much. And we also did a soil and earthworm survey and discovered not an awful lot was happening in the soil. So in terms of sectors, as I said, it's the southeast facing slope. We get our prevailing wind from the southwest, which is reasonably warm. And the lowest part of the forest garden area is reasonably sheltered, whereas the top half is very exposed to the wind. There is a road which is off to the western boundary of the whole site, and down at the lower part of the garden you don't really hear the road traffic so much, but up at the top end you really do. Not surprisingly, the highest region also gets the most sun, whereas as you go further down the slope towards the riparian forest on the eastern edge, you get less sun, and that area is more susceptible to shade, particularly early in the morning. And it's also susceptible to frost pockets. The frost can lie there for quite a long time during the winter. And to the north of the site is a farmer's field where you could potentially have pollution if he was spraying things, although talking with the farmer, he doesn't spray too much. He tends to really only use urea and the occasional fungicide. We spent a lot of time doing a lot of research and coming up with ideas, a lot of reading, mainly Martin Crawford's Forest Garden book along with Patrick Whitefield's Forest Garden book and the Eco Earth Care Manual. But in terms of actual specific plants, we were looking at what was going to be suitable for our site here, so the Fruit and Vegetables for Scotland books from the people who have Glendoick Nursery, Plants for the Future, Ken Fern, and Food for Free, because also what we didn't want to do is invest a lot of time and money putting plants on our site that probably exist down the road that we can harvest from. Particularly brambles. There's no point putting prickly brambles on your site when there's so many of them next door. And mycelium running just to get a better understanding of what's happening under the soil. I find YouTube to be a fantastic resource for forest gardens. Martin Crawford's the conventional one in the UK, however James Perigoni in America is also very good. He gardens on a small scale and he's very enthusiastic and has a lot of good information. And we also went to visit, well, I specifically went to visit a lot of sites. So Graham Bell's garden was our initially what inspired us to create a forest garden. We visited there during the PDC that my husband and I did in 2013. And since then I've been back a couple of times for various reasons, and every time I'm utterly inspired. And also our friend Kate Everett, who has a site up at Airlith, has an incredibly inspiring garden. So those inspired us to create a forest garden. And following on from that, I visited Tappenouth Farm up in Aberdeenshire and Nenya Milne's site, which is beautiful. And Nenya and I both visited Alan Carter's small-scale forest garden and following his blog of plums and pignuts. And he's got full of so much useful information. So this is where a lot of our ideas and inspiration came from. And before we started doing anything, there were two big decisions we wanted to make. And the first was reasonably easy. How many layers did we want in our forest garden? And we decided we wanted to sort of a canopy layer, which we have, the sort of biggest trees we have are walnuts and honey locusts. You know, a kind of sub-canopy layer, which is mainly sort of dwarf fruit trees, some shrub layers, herbaceous layers. We are planning on some root vegetables. At the moment we only have really horseradish, so we haven't put too many of them in. We do plan to do more ground cover plants, herbaceous perennials and climbers once the garden is more established. So that was reasonably easy. The real challenge for us was deciding whether or not to have swales. You know, we've watched so many videos and read so many books that talk about the importance of water capture. But most of these are based in Australia and in very dry countries and dry climates. And anyone we've spoken to in this country who's attempted swales has said it really hasn't been worth it because Scotland's so wet. And we looked at keyline. We watched a lot of videos and read a lot of keyline and stuff about from the agrarian people in America. And we looked, and we got our ordnance survey maps and looked to see if that would be applicable here. But as it is, we happen to be on the brow of a hill, so we couldn't really find a keyline point to start with on our site. We would have to go outside, but it turns out that the hills around us all drain off the road, and so we don't really get much water runoff onto our site. It's either the rain falls or we don't get any water at all, other than through field drains. So in the end, we decided not to swale, which is something we'll come back to later in the presentation. So this garden we've designed very much from pattern to detail. So the first thing we did was identify the best part of our site to grow a food forest, and we chose the area that was to the east of the site, which has the steepest slope because it has the most soil erosion and we need the most soil stability through the trees, and we chose that area. We wanted to leave the flatter areas for other purposes that wouldn't cope so well on a steep slope. Once we did that, we designed the canopy layer and windbreaks, and then we came down and looked at paths, where paths might go, and sledge runs and water slides, which are obviously crucial to a forest garden, and then looked into more detail at how we would group all our understory layers into beds and guilds. So in terms of trying to take all that information and make some sense out of it, the two main tools I was using here was Excel and Inkscape. And Excel was really helped me to organise the information in a way that was useful to me. So I created a spreadsheet with one tab for each layer of the garden. So one would be canopy layers, subcanopy, herbaceous perennials, and so on. And within that, for each plant that I was interested in, and what I did is I went through Martin Crawford's book initially, and particularly for the canopy layer, and seeing which type of trees might actually grow in our climate and with our aspect and rainfall, and which ones would be productive and generally speaking would be multi-purpose. And for each of those, I sort of tabulated the height and width of each of those, the fertility, whether it's self-fertile or self-sterile, how productive it was, what type of soil it would need, what kind of climate it required, did it need to be in the sun or the shade, would it be tolerant to wind and to frost, why you would use the output of that, and what time of year you would harvest it, and at what time of year would it flower, and how much maintenance did it require, and were there any compatibility issues. For example, walnuts release something called juglone, which is allelopathic to other plants. And from that, I then was able to create other tabs looking at guilds and pulling information from each of the previous tabs into one guild. And Inkscape was fantastic for then using a layering function, which basically was it's a bit like using overhead projector acetates. And so I'd have my base map, and then I could overlay zones on top of that, and then sectors to see where the frost pockets were. And then I could overlay forest garden layers. So I'd have a layer for the canopy, a layer for the understory layers of the perennials, the shrubs, and also another layer for water and for paths. And I could click these on and off and put as much information or as little information as I wanted. And those are the two main IT design tools I was using throughout the process. So having identified which space we wanted to use, the first thing I needed to do was design windbreaks and hedges. And so we did put a windbreak right along the north boundary between ourselves and the farmer. And that's where the northeast winds come from, which are very cold. We didn't want to make it too tall because we didn't want to shade out the farmer, because obviously the sun would be coming from our side through to his. So we've put in a mixed hedge along there of various things that would be good for wildlife in terms of habitat and also food, and also some edible things in there for us. There's lots of currants, there's cotoneaster, holly, juneberry, forsythia, various things that should provide interest and food and habitat across the seasons. We also wanted some sort of prickly hedge along the eastern edge to try and keep out and deter deer which come through from the forest that you can see on the eastern edge, the eastern perimeter. And that includes some willow as well for firewood. So other than around the edges of the site, we wanted to create a bit of a windbreak specifically for the forest garden. And we've done that in kind of two layers. So the tallest layer, which is face on to the wind, is made of willow, and that is, it's fast growing and it supports a wild variety of wildlife. We can use that, we can coppice that for firewood and use it for basketry and various things. And the sort of downward side of that, we've got hazel plus some sea buckthorn, a bit of bamboo, and some various other shrubs that we transplanted from the market garden. And they're a bit slower growing, but they should hopefully fill in the gaps at the bottom that the willow might create in terms of windbreak. So we want a nice full windbreak all the way down to the bottom. And the design, in terms of profile for that design, came from Martin Crawford's book on how you would design a windbreak. So having considered a windbreak, the next thing we wanted to look at was the canopy layer and sub-canopy layers. And, being Scotland, although, we do get a lot of sunshine in the summer, it's still not as much as some of the lower levels might need. So we wanted an open canopy layer. So once everything's fully grown, it still won't be a closed canopy because we want light to penetrate down through to the bottom layers. The overall profile or shape of the forest is such that the tallest trees are down towards the bottom of the hill and the furthest north. And that is so that the trees towards the south don't get shaded out by having a big tree in front of them. And also so that it blends nicely. There's a nice sort of profile and it will blend in and give a natural shape as it blends in with the riparian forest on the eastern boundary. When we were looking at the canopy layers, we were also looking at having a distribution of nitrogen fixers. So we have some autumn olives scattered around to give some nitrogen in the canopy layer, as well as some Elaeagnus and some sea buckthorn and other sort of soil feeders in the hedgerows. And when we were looking at where to site each of these trees, again, I had to go back to my Excel spreadsheet and look at what the requirements were for each tree. So, for example, these walnuts all give out juglone. So we had to be careful about what else we put next to those. And some of those are self-fertile, but some are self-sterile. So we needed a mixture of different walnuts. The challenge really was that most of the trees that want the most sun also are least tolerant to wind. And the way our site is, the sun is coming from the south, but the wind is also coming from the south, which is why we needed to put in the windbreak. So we're trying to get each plant what it needed and also try and get it next to something that would be productive for it. So having decided on the canopy layer, then wanted to look at how we would access the site to harvest and be able to get all this bountiful produce back down to the house with the least amount of fuss. So we've marked out some paths there, and to be honest, they are subject to move around depending on how the beds get made up. The most important thing for us was maintaining our sledge run. So the first 2 years we were here, we discovered there's a particular part of this hill that's great for sledging down, and we wanted to keep that clear so that we could keep on sledging. And in the summer, because we have this nice clear pathway down the hill, we can use that for a water slide. So that was our main people care aspect when we were doing this. And we also have a reasonably wide track that comes down the western side of the forest garden, and that's big enough that we can get our garden tractor down through there so that we can pick some things in the forest garden and load them up into the garden tractor and take that back down to the house. So then we move down to the understory layers. And the key thing here really is we want as much diversity as we can, and integrate different plants together so that you're building up a lot of synergy between plants and they're each feeding each other. So again, we looked at the pattern and layout of the beds, and we tried to lay out the beds so that we weren't creating wind tunnels, but also so that we could try and trap moisture where we could. So some beds, the beds that are kind of on contour, are trying to catch as much water as we can as it flows down the hill. Some beds are going vertically down, and that's to try and break up any wind that might come through the windbreaks. In terms of the beds themselves, we didn't specifically go and insist that every bed had a guild and everyone had a fruit tree and ground cover and insectary plants, pollinators, mulch, nitrogen fixers, but they do. So what we wanted to do was make sure that there was enough nitrogen fixers and dynamic accumulators spread across the breadth of the forest garden that the underground mycelium network would, shuttle nutrients back and forth to whoever needed it. Most beds will have all of these things in it, but if it doesn't, we don't think it's a big problem because there's so much going on in the garden that we think the nutrients will get shuttled back across. So what we do have is an array of fruit trees, usually supported by some sort of dynamic accumulator. We have an array of aromatic plants to, give off enough smells to attract pollinators, but also to deter pests, to try and mask the scents of things that pests might like. We have plenty of things in there to attract pollinators. And we're also trying to use as much ground cover as we can and mulch as we can. So there's a healthy diversity there. Everything that's in the garden is providing at least one function. We also were trying to design these beds to make them harvestable so that we can always get in and get access to the crops. There's no point growing things if we don't actually get to eat them. And we also want to try and make everything maintainable. So we need access to be able to prune the trees. We don't want the trees getting too tall, otherwise we're not going to be able to harvest. We will, once things get a bit bigger, do more chop and drop. And we were also trying to create microclimates and make the most of existing microclimates and match them to the needs of all the plants. Now, obviously, when you've got hundreds, if not thousands of different species, it gets to be quite a complex matrix. And which is why, to some extent, there's some of it has been designed in and some of it is we just take along cuttings and stick them in wherever there's a space in the ground. But at the design stage, when we first did this, we tried to maximise the conditions for each plant. And lastly, what's quite interesting when you're designing a forest garden is that many of the trees that you're planting aren't going to be mature or producing anything for maybe 5 or 10 years, or sometimes even 30 years when it comes to full maturity. So when we're designing the canopy layer and we're looking at the full size of the canopy and making sure it's an open space, when you then look at that in the ground, when you plant everything, there's acres of space between things. And what we need to do is then put in some more short-lived, maybe dwarf fruit trees and things in between those to get a maximum yield until the big canopy layer starts to shade them out. So we're also trying to plan, as well as spatially in 3 dimensions, also trying to include a time dimension to make the most of the sunlight before it gets crowded out. And as with every good permaculture design, we want to maximise as many yields as we can and maximise the probability of obtaining those yields. So to do that, every element wants to have as many functions as possible, and every function needs to be supported by as many elements as possible. So you can see here that for wind protection, we have hedges and willow coppice. The canopy layer will also provide some of that. We get food from the hedgerows, from the canopy, and all the different layers in the forest garden. Every layer provides habitat, including underground and the mulch layers and everything like that. We're collecting a lot of firewood, which goes into the house. We want a pollution barrier between us and the farm and the main road, and that not just that includes lots of water pollution, soil pollution, noise pollution, and anything else that might be getting sprayed in the air. So that comes from the hedges and willow coppices. And also we managed to get a lot of yields for basketry and weaving. It's not something we do right now, but we do think that there's a market for selling those materials, and also something that we might make in the future for Christmas markets. So that's mainly the design stage we've talked about. But now I want to talk about how we actually implemented all this. And obviously a forest garden is a very long-term project, but you have to start somewhere. So the first year we designed and planted the canopy layer and the windbreaks. And following on from that, we started to integrate some shrubs and herbaceous perennials. Now, we're probably covering about 1.5 acres with forest garden. You know, we can't afford to buy that many shrubs and perennials. So we've planted some, the ones that are probably slower growing, some of the bigger ones, and then in year 3, what we're then doing is creating beds around the canopy layer and the bigger shrub layers, and filling in those beds with more shrubs, perennials, and more ground covers. And then once the system gets a bit more established, we'll be able to put in climbers. So we're really using small, slow solutions. And to fill in that space, what we're doing is taking cuttings. So we're integrating the forest garden in with the rest of the site. So elsewhere on the site, we have hugel beds that have a lot of edible perennials, and we have a family garden with lots of flowers that attract pollinators. And so we've been taking cuttings from those and growing a lot of perennial edibles from seeds as well, and integrating them into the forest garden. So again, these are small, slow solutions, but we're integrating the forest garden with the rest of the site. So we're designing some beds up front, but what we're also doing is observing and interacting and seeing what works and what doesn't. And where we're finding if we've planted something and it's not working well, we can always move it somewhere else. We've changed the layouts of the beds from some being vertical to most of them being horizontal now to try and capture as much water as we can. Now we want to produce no waste, and what we're finding is that the deer, local deer population, are very attracted to our trees, and therefore we're reusing fencing that we took down to put around some of our trees to prevent the deer from eating them. So we want to produce no waste and reuse everything as much as we can. And we're trying to self-regulate dysfunctional behaviour. So we have a bit of a dichotomy here between, do we mow the space between the beds or do we mulch the space between the beds? Mowing takes, you know, some hydrocarbon in the shape of petrol for the ride-on lawnmower, and it does take time to do that around the garden. However, what we've discovered with mulching, we were trying to mulch the space between the beds with cardboard and wood chip, and it's very good at keeping down the grass, but we are finding that the thistles and the dock leaves and nettles still come back up through that, and you end up spending a lot of time and a lot of physical energy weeding. And so we decided from mowing to mulching back to mowing again. And we do think that now what we need to do is, rather than create lots of beds, is we want a smaller number. We're going to concentrate on a smaller number of beds and plant them up more densely to prevent weeds coming up through them. And also, as soon as we mulch those beds, we want to plant them up straight away as densely as we can, with as much ground cover as we can to stop the weeds coming up. And we also want to use as many renewables as we can. Things that might not necessarily think of as renewables, we're trying to recycle as much as we can. So we're very much a no-dig approach in this garden. We mulch with cardboard and then wood chip on top, and if we don't have enough cardboard, then we've been reusing silage wrap from the farm across the road, and those guys have no way of getting rid of that now. It's not our first choice, but it's very good for covering up a big space very quickly. But unfortunately, we are finding that nettles and thistles come up. If there's any gaps between the silage wrap, they always manage to find them. So we are recycling and reusing as much as we can. Good morning and welcome to the forest garden at Echo Earth Care. First thing this morning, we're just going to talk about the sectors that are affecting the site. So we're looking at the forest garden, and this is us looking up north. So you can see that the whole site really is on a south facing slope. Now if you can see that plume, here we go, of white steam, that's coming from near my Mosmoran, an ethylene plant. So that's probably our closest main source of pollution. The field, you can see the fence, that's the end of our land, and beyond that is a farmer's field. This field used to be part of the whole farm.
And so there is a potential source of pollution there if he was spraying anything, although to be honest he doesn't spray, he doesn't tend to do pesticides and insecticides. Coming round this way, this is to the west, you'll see some traffic going by, and that's a main road, which we're in COVID lockdown at the moment, so it's not too busy. That's also, now we're looking sort of southwest, this is the source with the main prevailing wind. You can see there is a bit of a windbreak down at the bottom, but the wind does still come across that hedge over there. Just looking down the side, this is a market garden, which is the feature of another video. And then we come to the forest garden. So that's the edge of the forest garden where you see the row of willow, and it comes up along and back up to the start. And you'll notice on this side we have a really nice riparian woodland, and the dower burn goes along that edge. So that's the woodland is the start of our neighbour's property, and there's a dower burn in there, which is very beautiful to look at. So the nice thing about this woodland next to us is all the birds and the wildlife that comes through, and the downside is all the wildlife that comes through, mainly in the shape of deer. So deer and pigeons are our biggest pests, really, in the forest garden. You can see this is 1st of June, it's about 8 o'clock in the morning, so the sun, we're facing east, the sun's coming up here, and it moves around during the day to come from this angle. And as you can probably see, if I walk down here, you'll see that we're on a bit of a slope. And we chose this slope, which is the steepest part of the garden, for the forest garden. So you can probably see more of the slope down there. It comes down to here. And at the far end, I don't know if you can see, right down there, there's some beehives. And there's some more beehives down about there. So I'd like to talk about windbreaks. The direction we're looking at is where the prevailing wind comes from, and you'll see a couple of things from windbreaks. So there's a small hazel hedge running along here, and then as we go up you'll see there's some small shrubs. You see a line of shrubs and hedging, and that's stuff that we transplanted from the market garden, but it's quite slow growing. And so we've put in this line of willow, you should be able to see coming all the way down from the bees, all the way along up here. And then it does go all the way, you'll see these tree guards from about here going all the way up as well. And what's interesting is this willow and all of that willow were planted on the same day. So you wonder what the difference is, and I'm just going to show you. You'll see at the bottom of the willow that's growing really well, there's some black plastic, which we don't normally like to do, but this plastic was recycled silage wraps from the farm across the road. So when we planted the willow this day, we used the silage wrap as a mulch to try and stop the grass from competing. You can see it's done amazingly well. We ran out of that plastic, and this side we didn't mulch. Now these were planted on the same day, about 2 years ago. No, 2 years ago, and the difference is incredible. Now, last winter we mulched this lot with cardboard and wood chip, and now it's starting to thrive now that it's been mulched. But without the mulch, it really hasn't done well when you compare it to all of this. So it's a real lesson. When you see these videos, they say whenever you plant trees or you plant anything, you mulch it to protect it from the grass and the weeds, and it makes a massive difference. So that's the windbreak on this edge, going all the way up here. At the very top, you won't see from here, but we can have a look later, we've planted a mixed hedging right the way along that fence line. Not too tall, because we don't want to shade out the farmer's field. Tall enough to give us some windbreak from the north winds that are quite cold. And also there's a gap between the fence and the hedge, which once it grows up should hopefully be a barrier from deer jumping over. And that hedge is mixed. It contains juneberries, roses, currants, hazels, hollies, lots of different things. with the idea that it provides a bit of a wildlife refuge, so there's lots of food in there for birds and butterflies and bees, some of it for us if we so choose, and hopefully if there's enough there to feed the wildlife they might not be so keen on our crops. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the patterns. We very much design from pattern to detail with this garden, starting off with the canopy layer. So if you can see the tallest trees, which are usually the ones with the big tall tree guards, what we wanted to do was have the tallest trees at the bottom, along the bottom. So you might be able to see, here it goes, a walnut here, another walnut here. So there's 4 walnuts along the bottom, a Tibetan white beam and some honey locusts. And we wanted the tallest ones at the back coming down to the shorter ones for a few reasons. One is so that it would blend in with this woodland at the back that we're joining onto, and also so that we're not shading out anything. And we also have some of the tallest ones further up the hill, so they're not shading out the ones in front, which are towards the south. So the tallest trees to the north and to the east at the bottom of the slope. So with some walnuts along the bottom, some Tibetan white beam, we have some heart nuts coming up as we go up the hill. Then we have some big mulberry bushes, some persimmons and quince. Then as we come down, we also have dotted in around everything, we have quite a few autumn olives. And they're there partly as pollinators, a lot of it to do with nitrogen fixing, and just really because they're very pretty. Coming down the hill we've got 3 almond trees, some cherry plums, and then as the canopy layer is getting smaller, we've got some snowbell trees and some juneberry trees. So, and one of the pattern was obviously the biggest ones at the back and the bottom, but also we wanted to make sure that when these things are full grown, it's not a closed canopy, because this is Scotland, and although it's sunny today, we're not famed for our sunshine. So we want to make sure that even once it's all grown, there's still daylight getting down to the bottom layers. And here you can see one of the autumn olive trees that we've put in. Such a pretty plant, pretty tree. And that's another pattern that we have in the garden, is of nitrogen fixers and dynamic accumulators. So when we were doing our map, we was using Inkscape to make the map, and we drew our canopy layer on one layer of Inkscape. And then we also have one layer on there of nitrogen fixers. And so across, rather than put everything in a guild where every particular tree has a nitrogen fixer next to it, we just made sure that there was an even distribution of nitrogen fixers across the garden, be that Russian olives or autumn olives, or be that comfrey or broom or any other nitrogen fixer. So there's a mixture of nitrogen fixers across the canopy layer, the understory, the shrub layer. So moving down a layer in detail, we've been designing from pattern to detail. The patterns of the layout of our beds has changed, has evolved as we've been doing the garden. So initially you can see we have some beds that are going horizontally across the slope. And then the next ones here are actually going vertically. And the reason we did that at the time is we really didn't want to have wind tunnels coming through the forest garden, because this site does get a lot of wind, although some of that's going to be blocked by the new polytunnel that we've just finished. But we are exposed to quite a lot of wind, and we wanted to try and break up the wind by having beds in different orientations. You can see even the ones that are horizontal are slightly curved. We want to try and capture some water here. And in each bed, generally speaking, there's a canopy tree or something, a canopy tree, and then we've got understory here. In this particular example, there's a cherry plum, and underneath that we've got some artichokes, some walking onions, some loganberries, some sorrel, some primula, some daylilies, some rhubarb. And what we did before we planted everything, so originally we planted the canopy layer and mulched it. And then the following year we've put down a layer of cardboard with lots of wood chip on the top. And we get free wood chip from our local tree surgeon. He's always looking for somewhere to put it, and we're always looking for more of it. So we've got a really good relationship with the tree surgeon. Coming across these are the earliest beds that we've put in, which is why they're looking quite a bit more full. These are black currants that we transplanted from other parts of the garden. They're bedding in really nicely. And this is one of the first beds we did. So you can see in this bed, here, we've got a cherry plum at the start. In the middle we've got a snowbell tree, and we've got a juneberry at the end. So we've got a few different canopy ones, and we've joined them together with some josta berries as a shrub layer. We've got these walking onions, and we've got at the bottom we've got some strawberries. Now we do plan to have a lot more diversity in the beds as time goes on, but there's only so much money we can afford to invest. And all of these plants here started off in we've got a little bit of a nursery forest garden down beside the house, which is one of the first areas we planted up. And so we start things there, and then we take cuttings and propagate. So everything that we see in this bed, apart from the canopy trees, have all been propagated and taking cuttings of from other bits of the garden, so it's been largely free. But the intent here just shows you that the canopy layer, some shrub layer underneath, and then some more ground cover stuff. When ideally we're aiming for about 7 layers in the garden. So we will be putting climbers in once there's things for things to climb up. There is obviously a lot of mycorrhizal fungi up there. Whenever we planted the trees, we put in mycorrhizal fungi with them. And we're intending that will spread the nutrients from one plant to the other. So this is why we don't have nitrogen fixtures in every single bed, because we assume that the nitrogen from the autumn olives and from the comfrey and everything are just going to get picked up by the mycorrhizal fungi web underneath and taken to where the plants that need it most. So this is like the kind of the northeast corner of the garden, which is the shadiest and the dampest. And even here some of the plants are struggling because it's been so cold, been so dry. And that gives you an idea of the gradient of the slope that we're working on here. So it might not look much of a forest now, but hopefully in 5 to 10 years it'll all start to fill in as we get more ground cover plants to stop the weeds coming up, and some of these canopy trees start to fill out.
So we've looked at how I created the design and how we've implemented it, and then we've had a little tour around the site to see how it's looking just now. I think it's always important to go back and assess the design against the original brief. So originally we said we wanted to apply the 3 permaculture ethics. If we look at earth care, we want to improve the biodiversity of the site. Now that we have done, probably 100-fold, through all the different trees and shrubs and ground cover and things that we've added. And also in terms of the soil, you know, we get all this wood chip and they all come from different trees, and all those different trees have different fungi and bacteria on them. So the soil especially has had so much diversity in it compared to before. In terms of reducing soil erosion, it's probably a bit early to say. Certainly the corner where we had noticed it before doesn't seem to be any worse. And carbon capture and sequestration. I mean, it's early days. It's very hard to assess a food forest after only 2 or 3 years. But carbon capture and sequestration, the soil certainly seems to be a lot more alive and would be holding a lot more moisture and hopefully a lot more carbon. And we have planted a lot more trees, especially willow and the hedging and the windbreaks. So definitely believe we've got a lot more carbon sequestration going on. Looking at future care and fair share, growing food and fuel for future generation. We haven't harvested any of the fuel yet because it's only been planted for 2 years, but it's certainly there and looking good for the years to come. But we're already harvesting some food from the forest garden. We've harvested some rhubarb, various salads, some sweet cicely, currants. So we're already harvesting food from the food forest, and it's only a couple of years old. We wanted to provide habitat to promote the longevity of a biodiverse wildlife. Certainly we're seeing a bigger range of animals in the forest garden. We're seeing different birds, we're seeing wagtails, we can hear the skylarks and chiffchaffs. We're seeing cinnabar moths. We've had little wild orchids growing in the grass. Lots of different fungi. So we're hoping that all this habitat is certainly created more different climates and different habitats for more diversity. People care create something beautiful. Well, it's early days yet. It's starting to look more beautiful, and certainly it sounds beautiful. And hopefully in 10 years' time it should look amazing. Create a food growing system that will be low maintenance in the long term. Well, compared to the market garden, it's definitely low maintenance. You know, we spend maybe a few hours every few weeks mowing it, and a bit of harvest and a bit of weeding. But compared to what we do in the market garden, it does seem to be lower maintenance. We are growing nutritious food. We specifically haven't incorporated many spaces for playing and socialising at the moment. We did certainly kept a space clear for sledging and for the water slide. And the reason we didn't do it is, when we went back to Cairney Mount design and the Secret Garden design, what I noticed then is I would design on paper a social space, but what would happen is my son in the Cairney Mount case, or the school children in the other case, they would use their imaginations and come up with something completely different. And what I find is that social spaces tend to present themselves rather than get designed in. They kind of pop up naturally. So I'm waiting to see what pops up once the garden's a bit more mature. Looking at the sort of positives, negatives, and interesting. I mean, there's a lot of things going really well in the forest garden. The fact that we're able to propagate and fill it very cheaply or for free by either taking cuttings from our site, from the market garden, the family garden, or sometimes taking cuttings when I'm out and about with my son. And also we've been had some very generous donations from friends, so Kate Everett and Nenya Milne. And growing a lot of things from seed that I didn't know that I would be able to grow. So that's been a real positive. Most of the canopy trees are surviving really well. One or two have had some deer damage, but most of them are doing quite well. We're definitely seeing an improvement in the soil. When I dig down now, if I dig a hole, I was planting the other week, I dig a hole just in the grassy area, and there was very little soil life. It was very hard even to get the spade into the ground. It's still very heavy clay. And then I went to plant something else in an area where there was a bed that had been mulched, and the spade slid in easily, and you could see the layers between, the grey, sort of grey-brown clay at the bottom coming up to a nice rich black layer where some cardboard and wood chip had already been converted into soil, and then a bit of a layer of wood chip on top. So definitely seeing an improvement in soil. We're seeing a big improvement in diversity in the wildlife. We're starting to get yields already. As much in pleasure as anything else. Some food, more wildlife. We've definitely got a more varied diet. So we've been eating globe artichokes, which we never ate before. Sweet Sicily. I've forgotten the names of some of the other things. So we're eating a lot of things that we wouldn't have eaten before. And the mulching is working well in terms of the areas that have been mulched. When we do dig into soil, it's very moist, whereas the areas that haven't been mulched are bone dry. And we just look at the willow, the bit that was mulched compared to the bit that wasn't, makes a massive difference. So I think those are real positives. Some of the negatives, we are seeing some deer damage and pigeon damage. Pigeon seems to like eating, or the deer perhaps eating the strawberry plants. The mulching, it sort of slows down the weeds for a year or two, but the docks and the nettles and things do come back again, so we need a different approach to that. It does take time cutting the grass in between the beds. If we did have sheep in before we put the trees in, and we found that they were just eating everything they could, which is why we've not gone back down that that route of having sheep or something to maintain the grass, because they just destroy all the trees. So we just have to take time to cut the grass. The erratic climate is a problem. When it rains, the heavy clay soil just gets really boggy, and when it doesn't rain, it just turns to brick. And we had April and May with next to no rain at all. We're now into June with still very, very little rain, and so we're really having to learn how to manage that. And the other negative here is when we started the forest garden, there was a water tap up there because that whole area was just pasture for sheep, and there was water that went up to some water troughs to feed animals. And when we first planted the garden, that was there, and then in subsequent years we created some ponds, and that meant we had to dig out the pipe that had the water going to it, and the pipe wasn't long enough to put it back in the same place, and it's now over at the western edge of the garden and doesn't reach the forest garden. And that is something we've noticed, that we don't have water locally to be able to water things in when we plant them. And the other thing that we really need to do better is labelling. So we've planted lots of different species that I've never seen or heard of before, and the labels will come off them when the wind or the rain washes them off, and then I've no idea what they are. Now luckily I have my maps that tell me what I planted and where, and I have to keep back referring to them. But if you're actually out in the fields, you can't really tell what's what, and especially if you weren't involved in planting them, you've got no chance. So my husband has no idea what most of these things are, so we need to improve our labelling. In terms of interesting, so obviously planting a forest garden is a very long, slow process. It can take decades to get full maturity, and that has its ups and downs. It's a long, slow process, so it feels like you're not getting anywhere fast, and you're waiting for trees to mature for maybe 10 years before you get harvest. On the other side, because it's a long, slow process, if you can see something's not working, it's very easy to intervene and move things around and fix things. And we know that it's a slow process, so we're not trying to fill the whole site at once. We haven't deliberately put in the social spaces just now. We're going to wait and see where some of those pop up. Another interesting facet we've noticed is when the ponds got put in, there are field drains through the field, and some of the field drains didn't get blocked, and we now have water leaking out of the ponds down through the field drains. And so the bottom southeast corner of the forest garden, if it's been raining a lot, the water overflows from the ponds and comes down, and it kind of makes that area really wet, which in the wintertime we're considering a major problem. However, since we've had this drought, the only area of the garden that is producing much in the way of yields is the area that has been soaked, because it gets the overflow from the pond. So it wasn't intentional, and maybe now what we need to do is put some sort of monk in to manage that, so that we can turn the problem into the solution, and make the most of that problem. Okay. So what have I learned from this design? And a good thing is correcting mistakes from previous designs. So when we were in Kearney Mount and we put in a masonry stove, we weren't able to grow our own firewood, which became very expensive, whereas now we've incorporated that into the forest garden. And also at Kearney Mount and the secret garden, I was trying to plan in where the social spaces were, only to find that that's not where people naturally use things. So this time we're going to wait and see where the social spaces pop up. And I think probably one of the bigger successes is looking at succession planning and planting. So when I did the design for Thankerton, for Mill Farm down in Thankerton, and I was making a script, and I planned the garden based on what the final size of the plants would be, I ended up with big massive spaces between the plants and lots of weeds growing up in between. Whereas this time, taking that into account with the planning, and making sure to incorporate short-term plants in that space until the mature trees get big enough to shade things out. Another big success this time is, while I've been doing the design, obviously Scott and I have done the implementation together, you know, and we've been learning over the last few years to work together and make a list of jobs and jointly decide what prioritisation is. So those are things that have gone well that hadn't necessarily gone well in the past. In terms of design tools, Martin Crawford's book's been invaluable in looking at the best way to have a canopy layer and how to blend in with the surrounding landscape. The simplest design methods, as always, is very flexible. It didn't necessarily encourage me to think about maintenance. That's something I went back to just by mentally running through Sadamit in my head to make sure I hadn't missed anything, and wanting to make sure maintenance was included there. And using Inkscape to have different layers has been very helpful. We've learned a lot of new skills for this design, and particularly trying to design in 4 dimensions, trying to look at a time point of view. For example, I know that the area down at the bottom of the hill in long term is going to be shady, but it's not shady now, so incorporating plants that don't mind being in full sun but also can cope with full shade to make sure kind of future proofing the design. Designing windbreaks I hadn't done before, using Inkscape I hadn't used before. I'd used Inkscape before but not the layers, and I think the layers have been very helpful for this design because it's so complex. Tree planting is not something I'd experienced of before, and also propagating through cuttings is a new skill. And stratification of seeds, particularly sweet cicely and other ones that need cold stratification, is something new, so that I've been propagating trees and other species that I wouldn't necessarily have done in the past. A bit of tree pruning, and my knowledge of perennial edible plants has increased 100-fold, I would say. Lessons learned, things that maybe we would do differently. So rather than us try and cover the whole area, is to start in a small area and work our way out. And just make sure that if we're going to put a bed in, we try and cover it straight away and plant it immediately after we've mulched it, rather than just put in a few shrubs and then by the time we come back to put ground cover in, the weeds have come back up. We really need to protect from deer early on. Now, I'm sure Martin Crawford's book and Patrick Whitefield's book both say that, but we wanted to be able to plant things and we couldn't wait 10 years for hedge to establish before planting them, so we cracked on. But I think, and although we did use tree guards on all of the canopy layer, when they get too big for that, the deer can still come in and munch away on those and the shrubs. Labelling, I seem to keep losing labels for things that either come off in the wind or the water washes them off. So we need to do something better about that. And we need to make sure that we have a nearby water source for watering things in, and also for watering plants when we're in these droughts, because it does seem to be a recurring theme every year. And lastly, we need to really start designing for the extreme weather conditions. Since we've moved here 4 years ago, we've been snowed in for a month. We've had a drought every year. We've had massive floods, and currently we're in lockdown with a pandemic. So I think the world conditions are getting more extreme, and that's things that we need to start designing for. So our next steps for the forest garden is we really want to try and consolidate and protect what we've already put in place. So we want to try and get lots of fast growing ground cover in all the existing beds to try and compete with weeds. Anything that can compete with buttercups has got to be amazing. Putting in more pest protection for the deer, and also going back to the water capture and management, be that putting in a water tap and also looking at potentially swales and monks to try and capture and manage the water that's coming in. Try and maximise the harvest better by labelling things so we know what we're actually picking and what we're looking at, and create a sort of a calendar and map of what to harvest and what time of year to harvest it, where it is in the garden and how to use it. So that's a new bit of documentation I need to create to get the most out of the garden. Longer term, we need to carry on filling in the gaps between the canopy layers in the top half of the forest garden and identify and develop social spaces. But all in all, I think the forest garden is looking pretty good. And I'd like to thank, as always, my husband. Although I did the design, I wouldn't be able to implement it without him. Great thanks to Graham Bell, Kate Everett, Nanya Milne, Alan Carter and James Reed for being inspiring people and for sharing their gardens with me. Thank the Kisby family and Stephen Dewar and Aberdare for helping doing some of the planting of the canopy layer, and our suppliers for some unusual things, the plant market in Dalgety Bay, who'll order in anything they can for us, Red Shed Nursery, an Apple Tree Man, and of course the Agroforestry Research Trust, where we've gotten most of our trees, and to Martin Crawford for consulting with me a few times by email on what may or may not work in this garden. So thank you very much for listening.